Not just an absence of war, but true peace. This year is the 100th anniversary of the armistice of World War I. Some of you, many of you, perhaps all of you are familiar with the story of the Christmas truce, the World War I Christmas truce. Some of you, how many of you? A lot of you know that story. To me, that's one of the most heartbreaking stories that I know. That's a story of a temporary absence of war, but not of true peace. Soldiers in the trenches on Christmas Eve began to celebrate Christmas with one another, sang carols, came out and began playing football, real football, European football, soccer, with one another. They sang carols together. They didn't want to kill each other. They didn't want to shoot at each other, and they didn't. And for Christmas, that held. But it wasn't enough. Because officers and politicians threatened them when they went back in the trenches, threatened them with death, with execution if they didn't take up arms the next day. And so the war continued. We've been talking about growth. Well, what's that got to do with growth? Well, I'll tell you. If you were here last week, you might remember that I was talking about an adaptation from The Way Churches Grow by Lauren B. Mead, an adaptation by Renee Ruhutsky, and that there are several types of growth in churches. And we talked about organic growth last week, the task of building the community, fashioning the organizational structures, developing the practices and processes that result in a dependable, stable network of human relationships in which we can grow and from which we can make a difference. And it is also the physical plant and the staff needed for the size of the congregation. And I mentioned maturational growth, the ability of a congregation to challenge, support, and encourage each one of its members to grow in the maturity of their faith, to deepen their spiritual roots, and to broaden their religious imagination. It is also the ability of the congregation as an institution to go deeper into the faith while maintaining the welcoming path for newcomers. Today I want to talk about incarnational growth. Incarnational growth. What are the outputs of the congregation's ministry? What is it that the congregation seeks to export from its life back into the life of the world, the social environment in which it exists? What are the good works that we are doing that will make the world a better place? What are the good works that we are doing that will make the world a better place? And what has that? How is she going to tie that all into Advent and Hanukkah and nurturing peace? Peace, true peace, not just the absence of war. You ready for your next Hebrew lesson? So shalom. Shalom. You have probably been taught, if you didn't spend a lot of time in Hebrew school or studying Hebrew, that shalom means peace and hello and goodbye. Anybody ever been taught that? Okay. It doesn't mean hello and goodbye. It is the greet. You know how when you're taught a foreign language and when you're little, you believe that there's always a one-for-one for every language, and then you get older and you learn that that isn't the case. I have been lied to. Okay. And peace it's not a one-for-one peace word either. we say peace in English, and we take for that whatever we mean. But shalom, the best translation for that is really, the best way I can translate it for you is the peace of God's wholeness. The root of that word is really wholeness. And so shalom is the peace of God's wholeness. So peace isn't I know there's a problem, but if we ignore it or if we don't say anything and we just let it, if we walk on eggshells around it, it will be fine. That is not shalom. That is walking on eggshells. And who's ever had the experience of walking on eggshells around a problem or around an individual so that you don't have, right? We've all, maybe it's been at work, maybe it's somebody in your family, maybe it's, we're going to Aunt Tilly's for Thanksgiving, and whatever you don't bring up Cousin Louise, and if we don't bring up Cousin Louise, everything will be fine. Now, is everything really fine? No, it is not. We're just not going to discuss it, so we have a non-confrontational Thanksgiving. Right? True shalom, true peace, means that we have done the work to repair. We have done the work to really be truly at peace, relaxed with one another. It's more than a Christmas truce. So how do we in incarnational growth, how do we do works? What are we doing? What are the good works that we are doing that will make the world a better place? How do we figure that out together and show that to the world? How do we live our mission? And I've asked you to be thinking about that some, right? Now, there are many different ways that we can do this. Maybe you've heard the story about the babies in the river. That somebody walks by and says, there are babies floating in the river. Oh no, we have to get these babies out of the river. And people start pulling babies out of the river. And that's important because you've got to get those babies out of the river. And that is important work. And a lot of people are doing that work, but then along comes somebody and says, I wonder how those babies are ending up in the river in the first place. And goes upstream to find out. Now, we still need people downstream to get the babies out of the river, but what a good idea to find out how those babies ended up in the river, because maybe we can stop them going in the first place. What's the work you want to be doing? This congregation has been doing a lot of downstream work, right? You're really invested in the West Side Men's Shelter, and that is so important. Some organizations and some people are way more invested in doing upstream work, working on legislation. How did people get to be homeless in the first place? How come these men are in a shelter instead of in their own places? What can we do to prevent them from ending up in the shelter in the first place? Also important work. Now, I'll tell you, there can be some danger in doing all the downstream work. I'm not saying it's not important work. I'm saying it's very important work. Don't go home saying, Pastor Madelyn thinks that the work we do at the West Side Men's Shelter is not important, because that is not what I'm saying. It is very important work. But the danger becomes when we get so invested in the downstream work that it becomes more about our need to do it than about solving the problem, and we invest in keeping the problem going so that we have the work to do. Does that make sense? Do you understand what I'm saying? So we have to be very clear when we're doing work about the reasons that we're doing the work, and if there are any ways that we could be doing it better, or if there are any ways that the work we're doing might be hurting rather than helping. So some of you know about, anybody have Tom's shoes? Or you know about Tom's shoes? I have some Tom's shoes. Tom's shoes said, hey, you know, there are people walking around in some countries around the world without any shoes at all, and like they can get worms in their feet and other things, and that's not good, and they need shoes. So for every pair of shoes we make and sell, we'll donate a pair of shoes in those countries. Well, that sounds like a pretty good plan, right? Until people in some of those countries start saying, hey, what do you think? We don't know how to make shoes here? And every time you do that, you're putting people out of work who... Oh. So instead of getting all huffy about it and saying, hey, but this is we want to do good, Tom said, oh, our bad. What if we built shoe factories here and put people to work here? All right. There was a young man who decided, and I don't know his name, and I'm not going to look up his name because I don't want to, I'm just going to say a young man, who decided that people in Africa needed T-shirts. Bless his heart. And started doing massive T-shirt drives for people in Africa, like there's no cloth in Africa, right? He didn't do his research. I do believe his heart was probably in the right place, right? But when we send massive amounts of used clothing to places where people know how to weave and make clothes, it doesn't do people who own businesses there any good. And why does somebody in Africa who can make his or her own clothing need my ratty old paint-spattered threadbare T-shirt? And what about all the resources that it takes to pack those things up and ship them, right? So I'm not saying our hearts aren't in the right place. I'm just saying we need to think about what we do and the purpose for which we are doing them. Whom are we really serving? Often the answer is we are really serving the people we think we are really serving, right? I mean, does the Westside Men's Shelter need our money, need our time? I mean, if babies are floating in the river, they need to come out, right? And if that's where the energy needs to be, or rather, and can it stand reevaluation from time to time? Do we need to always take a look from time to time at what we are doing, if the need is still there, and if it still makes sense? If we're truly going to have the peace of God's wholeness in the world, true shalom, we can't just think about, well, I've done my good work, or I feel good about this. Because I'm sure the soldiers in the trenches felt good about what they did on Christmas Eve. And they should. I can't imagine the angst of being a soldier in the trenches in World War I. I am not in any way laying any blame on the soldiers who started the Christmas truce. Because they didn't have everything that was necessary. They got together, but they didn't have the power or the momentum that they needed to keep that going beyond. It's not enough to just say, to just look at one event and say, yeah, I'm good. I did a good thing. I feel okay. We must constantly reevaluate. And what if they had been able to? What a world if they had been able to have more power, to turn around and say no to their officers. Hear me. I am not blaming the soldiers in the trenches. I blame the politicians. But what happens when we are able to reevaluate and join our power together and truly make change? What change would you like to see? What is the work that you want to do? Where is the piece of wholeness, the piece of God's wholeness that you want to create? You have that power. Collectively, you have that power. How do you want to make it happen? I know you can. The peace is within you.